The orchard had been dead for years. Everyone said so. 41 apple trees stood along the low hill at the back of the rented property, their bark the color of ash, their branches reaching up into the pale April sky like the fingers of something long buried. No leaves had come in the spring before. None had come the spring before that. The landlord had stopped mentioning them altogether, the way a person stops mentioning a debt they've already written off. The neighbors called the hill an eyesore. The man who farmed the prosperous land to the east had said once, leaning over the fence, with the comfortable authority of someone who has never had to gamble anything, that those trees were dead at the root, and the kindest thing would be to take a chainsaw to the lot of them. She had said nothing to that. She had learned to say nothing to a great many things. It was a pale Tuesday morning in early April when she stood at the orchard gate and counted the money in her hand for the third time, as if counting might change what was there. $8, 7 crumpled bills, and 4 quarters pressed flat against her palm. The mud at the gate was soft and dark from 2 days of rain, and her boots had already sunk past the ankle, and the cold came up through the soles, the way cold always does on a morning when you are trying very hard to think clearly. $8 was what remained after the rent payment and the last of the winter feed and the small things a person cannot go without. It was not enough to plant anything worthwhile. It was not enough to repair the south fence properly or buy the seed potatoes she had been pricing in her head for weeks. $8 was almost nothing. Almost. She stood at the gate and looked at the 41 gray trees, and she thought about the winter that was coming. Not this coming winter. There were months yet before that, but the one that lived at the back of her mind every single day. The one that would arrive in November and find her with an empty harvest, an empty root cellar, and a landlord who had already made it plain that the lease on the house and the land would not carry another season of nothing. She had until the cold came. That was all. If the land did not produce something between now and then, there would be no more seasons on this particular piece of earth. There would be no more of any of it. The countdown was not abstract. It had a feeling, the way a frostbitten finger has a feeling, numb at first, then aching, then something much worse if you ignored it long enough. She folded the $8 into her coat pocket. There was an auction in town that morning. She had seen the notice tacked to the feed store door 2 weeks back and had walked past it and then turned around and walked back to read it again. She was going to be late if she didn't start moving now. The auction yard smelled the way all auction yards smell in early spring. Manure and sawdust and the particular sharpness of animals pressed too close together in the cold. She arrived on foot, her boots already muddy from the road, and took her place along the rail fence, where the other farmers stood with their arms folded and their faces already settled into the expression of men who had decided what they were there to buy and what they were there to ignore. The morning moved through its usual order, hogs first, then cattle, then the miscellaneous lots that always came last, the ones the auctioneer himself seemed to regard as the dregs of the occasion. She waited. She did not rush the fence or push forward. She stood where she was and watched the animals move through the ring and watched the hands go up and come down and counted what she had in her pocket against what passed before her. When the lot of piglets came in, she knew them before the auctioneer finished his sentence. 37 of them. She counted quietly, her lips barely moving. They were small, undersized in a way that made even the word runty seem generous, and they moved through the pen in that particular nervous clustering pattern of animals that have been overlooked for a long time. Their coats were rough, their ears were too big for their heads. One or two of the older farmers laughed outright when the pen gate opened and they came spilling in, and the laughter had that specific texture of men who consider themselves beyond wasting attention on a thing. She did not hear the auctioneer's opening call. She was watching the piglets. What she saw was this. Even on the hard-packed dirt floor of the auction pen, even there, where there was nothing to root for, nothing worth turning over, they rooted. Every one of them, within 2 minutes of entering that pen, had its snout pressed to the ground and was pushing, probing, nosing into the packed earth with a focused and tireless energy that had nothing to do with hunger. It was instinct. It was the oldest kind of purpose. She recognized it the way her grandmother's handwriting had made her recognize things, not as a new idea, but as a confirmation of something she had already suspected without quite knowing she suspected it. The auctioneer started low and looked around the ring with the expression of a man who expected nothing. The farmers along the rail had already looked away. She raised her hand. The auctioneer paused. A murmur moved through the crowd, not loud but present, the way a shift in wind is present. Someone near the back post said something she did not catch, and a man to her left chuckled once and shook his head, the slow, deliberate shake of a person expressing pity. The auctioneer looked at her for a moment, then at the lot, then back at her. $8, she said. The yard went quiet in an amused sort of way, the way a room goes quiet when someone says something that everyone else considers obviously foolish. The auctioneer's gavel came down. She loaded them into the wagon bed 2 and 3 at a time, wrapping each one in her arms the way you carry something you are afraid to drop. They were small enough that she could manage it alone, though her back ached by the 20th one, and her hands were muddy to the wrists. They squealed and pushed against each other and against the slat sides of the wagon, and the sound of them filled the auction yard with a kind of noise that made the other farmers glance over once and then look deliberately away, the way people look away from things they find embarrassing. The road home was 3 miles of rutted county gravel, and she walked it beside the wagon, one hand resting on the sideboards, feeling the warmth of 37 small bodies, pressing and shifting in the bed. The sky was pale and colorless above the tree line. The morning had that particular stillness of early spring in a place that has not yet decided to wake up. She did not let herself think too far ahead. She thought only about the fence. She had known since the morning she left for the auction that the fence was the problem she would have to solve first. The orchard fence was old, gray wood and rusted wire, sagging in 4 places she had already identified and patched in her mind before she ever raised her hand in that yard. She had the wire, she had the hammer, she had the afternoon. It took her until the light went low and orange behind the dead trees. She pulled wire tight with her bare hands, where the pliers could not get a clean grip, and she reset posts by bracing them with flat stones she dragged from the far edge of the property. Her knuckles bled in one place, and she did not notice until she was nearly done. The fence was not beautiful, but it held. She opened the wagon's back slat and let them go. They moved into the orchard the way water moves into low ground, spreading, finding their own level, guided by something invisible. Within a minute they had scattered under the gray trees, their small, dark snouts already dropping to the earth, already beginning the work she had brought them here to do. She was still standing at the fence gap when she heard him. The prosperous farmer from the next property over had come out to the fence line between them, and he was laughing, not under his breath, but fully, openly, loud enough that the sound carried across the dead grass of the road and into the trees. He said something about good money after bad, though the exact words were swallowed by the distance. He said something else that made her jaw tighten. She did not turn around. Then the landlord's truck slowed on the county road, and the window came down, and he looked at the orchard and then at her, and he shook his head with the practiced patience of a man who has watched poor decisions being made for a very long time. "You are burning through what little you have left," he said. She did not answer him. She stood at the fence gap until the truck moved on down the county road, and the sound of the engine faded into the gray afternoon, and then she stood a while longer, listening to the piglets moving through the dead grass between the trees. A soft, persistent rustling, like something reading a page it had read many times before. She went inside when the light failed. The house was cold in the way that small houses get cold in early spring, a chill that settles into the walls and stays regardless of what you burn. She lit the lamp on the table and set it close, and then she went to the shelf beside the window where she kept the things she could not afford to lose. The notebook was there between a tin of seeds and a broken compass that had belonged to her father. She lifted it carefully. The cover was soft from years of handling, its edges gone dark with oil from someone else's hands, and the pages inside were filled with a cramped, careful script she had been reading since she was small enough to sit in her grandmother's lap and trace the letters without knowing their meaning. She carried it to the table and sat down in the lamplight and opened it to the page she had found 3 weeks ago, the page she had gone back to every night since. The handwriting changed slightly on this page, as if it had been written in a different season or a different mood, slower, more deliberate. The top of the page read simply, "Orchard Ground," and below that, in the same steady hand, the notes her grandmother had taken from observation and from the older women who had taught her, the women who had farmed through harder seasons than either of them would ever know. The passage was not long. It described how compacted orchard soil loses its ability to breathe, how old root systems go dormant when the ground above them turns to something closer to stone than earth, how the trees do not die so much as they wait. It described how rooting hogs were turned into exhausted orchards in the old days, not the fat, heavy animals grown for slaughter, but small ones, lean ones, the kind that work the ground with their snouts for the pleasure of it rather than out of desperation. They break the crust. They eat what rots. They leave behind what the roots need. She read it again. Then she sat with it for a while, just listening. Outside in the dark, she could hear them. 37 small bodies moving through the orchard, in the cold night air, rooting and rustling, and occasionally making that low, murmuring sound she had already started to recognize as contentment. The sound of creatures doing exactly what their nature intended, the sound of something beginning. She spread her hand flat on the page and felt the slight ridges where her grandmother's pen had pressed the paper, and she thought, someone knew this once. Someone knew it and wrote it down, and here it is. The cold did not leave quietly. It retreated slowly, grudgingly, the way cold always does in that part of the country, pulling back a little each week and then pressing forward again in the night, as if reconsidering. But by the time May arrived, there was a warmth in the middle of the day that had weight to it, something you could feel on the back of your hands while you worked, something that stayed in the wood of the fence posts, even after the sun went down. She was in the orchard every morning before the light was fully up, not to admire it, not to hope out loud. She went the way a person checks on something fragile, quietly, without making a fuss, as though too much attention might startle it back into stillness. She walked the rows between the old trees and watched the ground and watched the branches and watched the piglets, who had grown only a little, but who worked with the same focused industry they had shown from the first night, their broad, flat snouts pressing into the soil as though they could read something written down there. The signs, when they came, were nearly nothing. A slight loosening of the earth around certain root lines, not the dramatic heaving of turned soil, but a subtle giving, a texture change, the way the ground went from tight and packed to something that shifted slightly when she pressed her boot heel into it. She noticed it first along the base of the third tree from the eastern fence, an old tree with a trunk thicker than her waist. One of the ones she had privately feared was the most gone. She crouched down and pressed her fingers into the soil there, and it yielded just enough to leave a print. She stayed crouched for a moment, not moving. Then she noticed the branch. The lowest branch on the oldest tree, the one at the center of the orchard that she thought of, though she had never said it aloud as the anchor tree, had a thread of green along one short section, barely longer than her finger. She had to crouch and shade her eyes and look at it from a specific angle to see it at all. It was the color of something that had not decided yet whether it was going to live or die. Not a leaf, not a bud, just the faintest change in the gray-brown surface of the bark, the thinnest imaginable signal. She took out the small notebook she had started keeping, a plain paper one she had bought for a few cents at the feed store, and she wrote it down in the margins alongside her grandmother's words. Third tree east, soil yielding. Anchor tree, low branch, faint green. May. She noted it the same way her grandmother had noted things, plain, precise, without sentiment, as though the observation itself was the important thing and needed no decoration. The neighbors walked the road that afternoon. A few of them glanced toward the orchard over the old fence. None of them stopped. None of them looked long enough to see what she had seen. She did not call out to them. The notebook filled slowly through the last days of May and into the first week of June. Small entries, plain and spare, the way her grandmother had taught without ever meaning to teach. The date, the tree, what she observed, soil condition, piglet behavior, whether the morning air smelled wet or dry. She wrote in the margins because the notebook was thin and the pages needed to last, and she had learned not to waste anything. The piglets were heavier now, not large. They were still small animals, with a long way to grow, but the runty sharpness had softened out of them. Their sides had filled. They moved through the orchard with a kind of settled purpose, working the rows in loose patterns, nosing along the base of one tree and then another. She watched them and noticed they spent longer near the older trees now, the ones with the deepest roots. Whether that meant anything, she could not say for certain. She wrote it down anyway. Then June opened, and the orchard changed. It did not happen all at once. The first blossom appeared on a middle row tree, low on a branch, pale as old cream, so pale she almost mistook it for a trick of the morning light. She stood still for a long moment before she let herself believe it. Then she crouched and looked at it straight on, close until she could see the shape of it clearly. 5 small petals, delicate and new, opening against bark that 1 month ago had looked as dead as firewood. She wrote it down. She did not call out to anyone. By the end of the first week of June, 3 more trees had bloomed. By the second week, 7, then 12. The blossoms came in waves, not all together, but staggered down the rows like something waking up slowly from a very long sleep and not yet sure of the hour. The whole orchard began to carry a faint, sweet smell in the early mornings, light enough that she almost thought she imagined it, and then strong enough that she stood with her eyes closed and simply breathed. It had been more than a decade, the old-timers said, since this orchard bloomed. She had heard them say it to each other with the flat certainty of people describing something already finished. One afternoon, she was working at the near fence, restringing a section that had begun to sag, when she heard small feet on the road gravel stop. She looked up. A girl from down the road, young, maybe 10 or 11, the daughter of one of the neighboring families, stood at the fence post with both hands wrapped around the top rail, staring into the rows of blossom trees with an expression of complete and unguarded astonishment. The girl said nothing. She just stared. The woman looked at her for a moment, then smiled once, quietly, and turned back to the fence wire and kept working. There was nothing to explain. The orchard was explaining itself. She pulled the wire taut and wound it around the post, and somewhere behind her, a piglet moved through the soft-turned earth between the roots. June gave way to July the way it always does in that country. Without announcement, without ceremony, just a heaviness in the air that arrives one morning and does not leave. The light changed. The shadows under the orchard trees grew shorter and darker, and the ground between the rows, which had been soft and yielding since May, baked slowly back toward firmness at the surface while staying cool and loose beneath. She knew this because she walked it every morning, pressing her heel into the soil along each root line, reading what was underneath by what her boot told her. And then, in the first week of July, the fruits came. Not abundantly, not dramatically. They appeared as small, hard swellings at the ends of the new growth, green, tight, smaller than a child's fist. But they were there on branches that 2 months before had been gray sticks, holding nothing. She found the first cluster on the 3rd tree from the east fence, and she stood looking at it for a long time without touching it. Then she moved to the next tree and the next. By the time she had walked the full length of the first row, she had counted fruit on 19 trees. By the end of the second row, it was more. She did not celebrate. There was too much work for that, and too much still uncertain. The piglets had grown through June with a steadiness that had surprised even her. Their bones had filled out, their coats had thickened, and they moved through the orchard with a deliberate, industrious energy that she had come to trust. But they needed grain to supplement what the ground gave them, and her supply was running low. She had bought enough at the start to carry them through spring, rationing carefully, stretching each bag further than she had planned. Now she stood at the bin on a Tuesday morning and saw that what remained would last perhaps 3 more weeks, 4 if she tightened the ration further. She carried the numbers in her head all day while she worked, moving fallen fruit away from the root zones so it would not rot in the wrong places, checking the old graft scars on the lower trunks where she had noticed new bark forming, thinning 2 places where young branches had grown too close together and were beginning to crowd. The piglets followed her loosely as she moved, the way they had learned to do, rooting at whatever her hands turned over. The question she could not stop turning over was simpler and harder than any of the orchard work. 37 piglets, all of them now healthy, all of them growing, each one worth something at market. Selling even a few would buy grain enough to carry the rest through to September. It was the logical thing. It was the thing any practical person would call obvious. She looked at the green fruits on the branches. She looked at the piglets working quietly in the long July light. She picked up her thinning shears and moved to the next crowded branch, and she did not decide yet. The green apples grew slowly through July, small and hard and without color, and she kept her count of them the way she kept her count of grain, carefully, without sentiment. August came in heavy. The air thickened overnight, the way it does in that last stretch before summer breaks, and the orchard held the heat close between the trees. She woke each morning and walked the rows before the day got too far along, checking the fruits that now hung with a little more weight than they had the week before. Still green, still hard, but there was something in the skin of them that had not been there in June. A faint tension, the kind that comes just before something begins to shift beneath the surface. She sold nothing. The grain was stretched further than she had ever stretched it. She had cut her own meals down without quite deciding to, the way people do when the numbers don't lie. A smaller plate at noon, water instead of the second cup of coffee she used to allow herself. The piglets were healthy, and she intended to keep them that way. What came out of that intention was a quiet and steady deprivation. She did not speak aloud to anyone. It was a Thursday in August when the prosperous neighbor's hired man appeared at the fence. He came on foot, which was unusual, and he leaned on the old post in the easy way of someone who has no particular stake in what he is about to say. She was working near the middle row, hand-clearing a patch of ground beneath one of the trees that had been slower than the others to show fruit. She heard him and straightened and walked over. He looked at the trees for a moment. He was not unkind, exactly. That was the thing that made it harder. He was simply a man stating what seemed to him like plain fact, the way you'd comment on the weather. Even if some of them do come, he said, nodding toward the branches, it won't be enough to matter. You'd need the whole of it, every tree carrying, to make back what you've put in. He paused. That's not what's going to happen here. She listened. She had learned that summer that listening cost nothing, and that arguing cost more than she had left to spend. She nodded once. She said that she would know more by October. He looked at her for a moment longer than was comfortable, and then he nodded too, slowly, the way people nod when they feel mild and honest pity, and he pushed off the fence and walked back the way he came. She stood where she was for a moment after he had gone. The piglets were moving somewhere in the far end of the orchard, their sounds coming softly through the thick August air. One of the trees directly in front of her, one she had spent extra time clearing around, held a cluster of 4 apples that were, she noticed now, the faintest shade different from the others, not green anymore. Almost, but not quite. The landlord came on a Tuesday morning in early September, when the dew was still heavy on the grass, and the air carried the first faint suggestion that summer was preparing to leave. She heard his truck before she saw it, the slow crunch of tires on the dry dirt lane, and she came out from between the rows, wiping her hands on her work apron, the way she always did when she knew something difficult was arriving. He was not a cruel man. That had always been the harder part. He was simply a practical one, and he had been patient longer than most men in his position would have been. He stood by the gate with a folded paper in his hand and looked out over the orchard before he looked at her, the way people do when they want to give difficult news, time to arrange itself. He had received an offer, he told her, a developer out of the county seat. The man wanted the land for a lumber operation, and the offer was a fair one, more than fair, by his accounting. He intended to accept it. The lease would be terminated at the end of October, which gave her time enough to make other arrangements. And he said this last part gently. The way you say something you know doesn't help. She stood still and did not look at the paper. She looked at the orchard instead. The trees were full of apples now, small still and just beginning to turn, the pale green giving way in patches to the first thin blush of color. Not red yet, not enough to show a man standing at the gate what was really happening inside those rows. But she could see it. She had been watching it by the inch for weeks. She asked him one thing. She asked him to come back in 4 weeks before he signed anything. Just 4 weeks. If what she believed was coming had not come, she would pack the Piglets herself and clear the lease without argument. He looked at her the way people had looked at her all spring and summer, the quiet, tired look of someone who sees effort and wishes it were enough. Then he looked at the trees again, and something in the way the branches held the light seemed to make him pause, just briefly. He folded the paper and put it back in his coat pocket. 4 weeks, he said, not a day past mid-October. She thanked him. She didn't say anything more. After his truck had gone back down the lane, she turned and walked into the orchard. The piglets moved around her feet in the low morning light. She stopped at the tree with the 4 apples she had been watching since August and touched one of them lightly with her palm. The color was deepening, slowly, but it was there. October came in cold and clear, the way the old farming almanacs always promised it would when summer had been warm and the rains had fallen right. The sky turned that hard, particular blue that has no gentleness in it, only brightness, and the mornings arrived with frost on the fence rails and breath rising from the piglets in small white clouds as they moved through the grass. And the apples came, not slowly the way they had been building all through August and September. Fast, the way ripening sometimes moves in that final stretch, as if the trees had been saving something, holding it back until the cold gave them permission to let go. She walked the orchard at first light on the second morning of October and stopped where she stood. Every tree, every one of the 41. The branches were bowed with the weight of deep, red fruit, more than she had let herself fully imagine through all the long watching months. The color was not pale or uncertain. It was dense and true, the kind of red that catches light and holds it. She stood there for a moment without moving. Then she went and got her baskets. She started before dawn each day, working by the gray pre-light until the sun came over the tree line and turned everything amber and cold. The apples came off the branches clean and firm, nothing soft, nothing split. She filled basket after basket and carried them to the road in the early quiet, her boots dark with dew and her breath coming steady with the rhythm of the work. The piglets rooted between the tree rows as she moved, still working the soil as they had done since spring, unhurried and complete. The neighbors began to notice. Not loudly. No one came down the lane or called out from the road, but they slowed when they passed. A wagon that had been moving at a full pace would ease just slightly as it reached the gap in the fence line where the orchard was visible. A woman who walked the county road each morning, for as long as anyone could remember, had begun to stop at the crest of the hill and stand there a moment, looking down toward the trees before moving on. Two men repairing a fence on the opposite property kept finding reasons to turn in the direction of the orchard. None of them said anything. They just looked. She noticed. She noticed the way she had noticed everything else this year, quietly, without making anything of it, filing it away. The orchard smelled the way orchards are supposed to smell in October, sharp and sweet and faintly fermented where the windfalls lay in the grass. It was the smell of abundance. It was the smell of an answer. She kept filling baskets. The trees were not finished yet. He came on a Tuesday in the second week of October. She heard the creak of the gate latch before she saw him and did not turn right away. She was lifting a full basket from the ground near the third row, and she set it down carefully on the line of baskets along the fence before she straightened and looked. He stood at the orchard gate with one hand still on the iron ring, and he did not open the gate further. He simply held it and looked at what was in front of him. The trees were loaded, every one of them. The branches pulled low with the weight of fruit, the same branches that had been bare gray sticks when he last walked this ground in September with papers folded in his coat pocket. The apples were red, deeply, fully red, the way apples in old paintings are red, the way children draw apples when they have never been disappointed by one. The light in the orchard that afternoon was the particular low October light that makes everything it touches look like something remembered rather than something present. He did not speak. She did not speak either. She picked up another basket and carried it to the fence line and set it down. She went back to the nearest tree and began filling again. The piglets moved at the far end of the orchard, small and unhurried, as they always did. He stood at the gate for a long time. She had counted 11 baskets along the fence and was working on the 12th when she heard another set of footsteps on the lane. Heavier boots, a deliberate pace. She did not know this man, but she had heard a neighbor had sent word to the county market about the harvest, had said it plainly one afternoon over the fence without looking at her directly, as if mentioning the weather. The buyer walked through the gate without asking, the way buyers do, and moved into the first row of trees. He was a broad, quiet man with a ledger book tucked under one arm, and the expression of someone who had been disappointed before and was calibrating carefully against that memory. He touched the fruit with 2 fingers. He lifted a single apple and turned it, checked the skin, pressed it lightly at the stem. He moved to the next tree and did the same thing. He walked the full length of the row and turned into the next without a word. She watched him without appearing to watch him. The landlord still had not moved from the gate. The buyer reached the far end of the last row, paused, and opened his ledger book. He stood there in the long afternoon light, doing arithmetic, his pencil moving slowly, and the orchard was very quiet, except for the soft sound of the piglets in the grass and the occasional thud of an apple finding the ground on its own. He came back to the gate slowly, ledger book closed, pencil tucked away. He looked at her directly this time and told her what he could offer per bushel and what volume he expected from a harvest like this, and what the total would be if she could deliver to the county market by the first week of November. He said it plainly, without ceremony, the way men who deal in real things speak when the real thing is in front of them. She said she could deliver. He nodded once and walked toward his truck, and she followed, and he spread the contract across the tailgate in the last flat light of the afternoon. She read it through once. She signed it with mud still on her boots and his pencil still warm from his coat pocket. And when she handed it back, he folded his copy, tucked it into the ledger, and drove out the lane, without looking back at the orchard. He had seen what he needed to see. The landlord was still at the gate. He did not say much. He looked at the trees for a long moment, the way a man looks at something he had already decided was worthless and is recalculating. Then he told her he would hold the lease through the winter. He told her that when he was ready to sell, if he decided to sell, he would come to her first, before he spoke to anyone else. He said it quietly, without apology, and turned and walked back up the road toward his own property. She stood at the gate until she could no longer hear his footsteps. Then she turned back into the orchard. The last light had come down low through the trees and was catching the apples the way fire catches at the edge of something. Not burning, just glowing, each one holding the warmth of the whole long season inside it. The grass between the rows was soft and torn, where the piglets had worked it all spring and summer and into the fall, and the soil beneath was dark and loose and smelling of good earth, the way soil smells when it has finally been allowed to breathe. 37 piglets moved through the last of the light, unhurried, rooting gently at the grass roots, their small sounds the only sound in the whole orchard. She walked to the old fence post at the far corner, the one she had restrung herself in early spring with wire and her own 2 hands, and she leaned against it and watched them. The trees rose around her, all 41 of them, bowed and heavy and red, alive in a way no one who had looked at them in March would have believed possible. She did not say anything. The land had already said everything there was to say.